In 2024, there was a war in Korea, the Peninsular War. North and South Korea went at it again. The North largely fell apart, leaving chaos in its wake, and so the American Empire called on the United Nations to deploy peacekeepers. The Japanese stepped up and sent in a large number of troops to protect civilians from the remnants of the North Korean People's Army. This was not without controversy, as the cyborg commando unit PKF precipitated a massacre at a refugee camp near the border with China. And obviously, none of that happened. It was all speculation, written circa 2003 for a show that aired in 2004, thinking of probable scenarios for a backstory for Hideo Kuze, the antagonist of the second season of the anime Ghost in the Shell Standalone complex. Since so much of that series relies on military-political intrigue, the various writers felt compelled to lay out the state of the world in 2031-32, which is when the events of Standalone Complex take place. To make the world of Standalone Complex possible, World War III occurred sometime after the turn of the millennium, including Tokyo being nuked into a newly expanded Tokyo Bay. Look at the big old chunks out of Japan here. Despite that, Japan stayed neutral and even came up with a nanomachine technology called the Japanese Miracle, used to clean radioactive fallout. The country being somewhat unscathed meant that they could play a role similar to the US after World War II and gain a new economic prominence in the post-war reconstruction. The invention of that anti-fallout tech, plus the fact that most nukes were used up in World War III, combined with the massive destabilization created by that war, led to a worldwide spread of violence and state collapse called the Non-Nuclear World War IV, which is where many of the players of Standalone Complex cut their teeth. Separate from the geopolitics, this timeline went hard on the creation of cybernetic interfaces, called cyberbrains, in their universe. In rich countries like Japan, most citizens had at least basic cyberization done on their brain, though it varied from a basic computer interface in an otherwise normal brain to a brain that was almost entirely mechanical, like that of a certain someone. Welcome back again to Left Below. This is based on a panel that I did for Otakon 2025 called Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex 20th Anniversary Cyberpunk: A Future Past. And the purpose of that intro before was part of an elevator pitch for the panel itself. It's a kick-ass anime to talk about, and it does happen to be about 20 years since the second season. But it's especially interesting as the 20th anniversary of a show that was set at the time 28 to 29 years in the future. Near-future sci-fi, as hard as Asimov or as soft as Back to the Future or The Jetsons, is always interesting, especially as we get further and further away from when the work was created, with the most straightforward example being how they thought technology would evolve. Standalone Complex, which is how I'll refer to the show because saying the whole name is way too much of a mouthful. But anyway, Standalone Complex has a reputation for doing a lot more than just showing off some neat tech, though it has that in spades. No, we've got the hard stuff here. Political intrigue and philosophy. With that, I'm going to start off talking a bit about the series itself. The overall series of Ghost in the Shell was first created as a manga running from 1989 to 1991 by Masamune Shirow, who drew a sequel series in 1997 and had a few re-releases with additions as late as 2003. What really put the series on the map was the 1995 film animated by Production IG and directed by Mamoru Oshii, which had a sequel film in 2004 coinciding with the second season of Standalone Complex. Both of these were based on stories from the original manga. Standalone Complex itself aired on the Japanese TV channel Animax in 2002-03 for its first season, and then second gig aired in 2004, so yeah, I'm a year off from the proper 20th anniversary, but I had the idea for this too late last year. Be nice. What set Standalone Complex apart from the movies was that it really expanded the story, being original plot lines with only limited guidance from Shiro himself. Now, what got the series on my radar, and probably that of any of my viewers older than 25 or so, was its slot on Adult Swim's Saturday night anime block before Toonami was cancelled off of daytime Cartoon Network. Standalone Complex started on Adult Swim in November '04 and has stayed in rotation off and on ever since. It didn't have quite the universal acclaim of other early Adult Swim anime hits like FLCL, Bleach, or Death Note, but the show found a strong base that breathed new interest into the franchise after the film. Now, quick spoiler warning, I'm not here to do a full plot summary, but in order to do the kind of analysis I want, I'm naturally going to have to spoil some of the plot beats. But I will summarize the cast for those who haven't seen the show in a while. The core cast are all members of an elite counterterrorism task force for the Japanese government, Public Security Section 9, usually called Section 9 for short. Section 9 is helmed by a man named Aramaki, who serves as the chief for the purposes of the plot. Then there's the series heroine, Motoko Kusanagi, mainly called the Major. And in this series, she's kind of this larger-than-life character mostly, though occasionally we do get to see things more from her level and have her be a bit more humanized. Rounding out the team is Bato, a former American Army Ranger, Saito the Sniper, Paz and Borma, who are generally those two guys, Togusa, who's the normal guy and a family man, and Ishikawa, who's the dedicated hacker and guy in the chair. The episodes of both seasons are divided between serialized plot-moving affairs and one-shot. In Season 1, the standalone episodes are called Standalone, and the serialized ones are called Complex. In Second Gig, they're divided with standalone episodes being called Dividual, and then episodes following one of two major storylines confusingly called Individual, with episodes following the other of the two storylines called Dual. Now for the structure of the rest of the video, I'm introducing my new patent-pending style called Levity Sandwich, because there are 3 areas I want to look at and 2 of them are distinctly heavier than the third, so the relatively more fun one's going to go second. With that, let's dive into the deep end and start talking politics and current events. If there's any common criticism to Standalone Complex, it's that it doesn't shy away from being a political drama. Not even because of tackling controversial themes, but because the political thriller genre is something of an acquired taste. Stuff like The West Wing or House of Cards were widely beloved, but distinctly not for everyone, and can be a hard sell to action anime fans. Though the political themes of the 2 seasons are super relevant. The first season's antagonist, the Laughing Man, was trying to expose a large conspiracy between the government and a major pharmaceutical company, because it turned out that there was one drawback to sticking electronics in your brain. Sometimes your brain would have an immune response leading to cyberbrain sclerosis, which for a long time was incurable and would cause progressive scarring in the brain until you died. The accepted cure, which was not entirely effective and also very expensive, was a micromachine treatment using nanomachines, which the show insistently calls micromachines instead, to try and heal the scar tissue. Because of that nanomachine tech I mentioned earlier used to clear out radioactive fallout, micromachines were a huge business in Japan, and a cure for a deadly disease that heavily used them was big business for them too. Adding insult to injury, there was a cheap and effective vaccine called the Murai vaccine, which was suppressed by the government due to the influence of the micromachine companies, with the thin but real excuse that Dr. Murai, its inventor, didn't really know how it worked. The government knew the vaccine worked to the point where they actually approved the treatment in secret for certain VIPs and then denied up and down that those VIPs ever received the suppressed treatment, with Dr. Murai dying in poverty and obscurity before the events of the first season. The micromachine companies had influence not just with the government broadly, but with the ruling party specifically. The general secretary of the ruling party, a thin pastiche of the perennial Japanese ruling political party, the center-right Liberal Democrats, was tight with the main company targeted by the Laughing Man, Serrano Genomics. When Section 9 started sniffing around, the party head leaned on the cabinet to get Section 9 declared a rogue group and targeted by their equivalent of the DEA, the Narcotics Suppression Squad, who had powerful military-grade mechs. Controversial vaccines, big medical companies behaving badly, a heavily armed narcotics police force doing political dirty work. Who could have come up with such a wild and unrelatable scenario? The concept of medical conspiracies specifically is one that has had a lot of pull. The usual story is something like, oh, they've had a cure for AIDS, a cure for cancer, but they won't release it because antiretrovirals and chemo are more profitable. Nothing that radical is true, according to the British medical academic Ben Goldacre in his book Bad Pharma. But more mundane types of corner-cutting and shady science and suppression of evidence does occur. More on the scale that would allow the micromachine treatment for cyberbrain sclerosis to be accepted than the one that would conspire to hide the existence of the Murray vaccine, however. In the post-COVID landscape, medical conspiracies have flown fast and thick for every aspect of the COVID response, whether for the disease's origins, masking, social distancing, and of course the vaccines themselves. Full disclosure is I'm mostly on the side of the medical establishment in those disputes from the evidence I've seen, but like Goldacre's book indicates, there are an abundance of reasons not to trust the medical business fully. One of the indisputable conspiracies of recent history was the OxyContin debacle, where Purdue Pharmaceuticals deliberately misled people about how the pill could be metabolized both in terms of its addictive capacity and the possibility for overdose. A conspiracy that set off an opioid epidemic that is only now beginning to subside. But I think what Ghost in the Shell speaks to is the underlying fear of loss of control that comes from dealing with very technical diseases like cancer or dementia. It does take a certain amount of faith in the system to treat diseases like that, and the system has demonstrated that it isn't always worth that faith. One of the most harrowing moments for the Major in the series comes from when she has to put her trust in a nurse, as depicted in the scene here. This scene plays to the underlying fear behind medical conspiracies, that even the strongest of us have to make ourselves vulnerable and hope that the other party is on the up and up. Now, Season 2's driving plot is even more topical. Remember those 2 extra world wars I talked about in the intro to this video? They generated a lot of displacement around the world, and since Japan was neutral in the Third World War and mostly untouched, again, setting aside that giant hole where Tokyo used to be, that meant Japan was a particularly popular destination for large refugee communities. The second season specifically focuses on the artificial island of Dejima, which is being used as a semi-permanent refugee camp. Camp here is being used pretty broadly. Dejima is built up like a city, albeit in a dense ghetto fashion, but the people there don't have a path out to participate in wider Japanese society, being kept on the island, which creates a lot of resentment among them. Of course, many of the Japanese aren't happy with that arrangement anyway and are agitating throughout the season to have those refugees removed entirely. Though the show doesn't go into what the conditions are like for them back home, the flashbacks of the Major and Saito in Mexico give us some idea of what a lot of the world turned into after that non-nuclear Fourth World War. This xenophobia isn't unleashed directly, but it does get manipulated by a shadowy rogue faction in the government, made by the series' most compelling villain, Kazundo Goda. Like, yeah, look at this dude. I know they say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but go right ahead with this guy. He had an idea to ignite the refugee crisis into a full-blown rebellion as a cover to reforge Japan into a fascistic society. He wanted charismatic terrorists like Hideo Kuze to do the dirty work for him of reforging society, and use the desperation of the refugees pitched against Japanese xenophobes as the spark that would ignite the flame for that forge. And for this one, look at any headline from the rich world from the last 10 years. A series of migration crises have kind of combined into a single refugee omni-crisis. Whether it's Venezuela, Ukraine, formerly Syria, the Sahel countries, or Palestine, there have been many political flashpoints centered around refugees and people trapped in a political second class as a consequence of conflict and the resentment their presence breeds among host country populations. Lots of political movements in rich countries today are built around resentment of refugees and using that as an excuse to try to remake their countries in their own images, like Orange Man bad. Do I have to go into this yet again? Now, you could say migration and anti-immigrant backlash has been a thing throughout human history. Why is this relevant to Ghost in the Shell? But I think the specifics of what they're showing with Dejima and Goda are particularly relevant for today, where countries are willing to let refugees live among them but not as equal members of society, creating an easier target for xenophobes and making more resentment in the refugee community. Likewise, Goda's attempt to overthrow democracy specifically over the refugee problem is especially relevant to our modern times. Where will that end up? We'll see, but for now let's move on to the lighter side and talk about tech. Of course, the eponymous tech of Ghost in the Shell is the shell, the cyberbrain. Described at the beginning of the video, cyberization ran to about 3 tiers, the first being simple brain-computer interfaces, essentially plugging you into other people, computers, and the internet broadly. The second tier involved having some cybernetic body parts, and the third tier, where the Major and Hideo Kuze are, where all that's left of the biology are small parts of their brains. And this is one case where pretty rapid advancements have been made in the real world towards that fantasy. And no, it's not just Elon Musk doing this. I'm tired of that bum taking credit for everything. His Neuralink company has competitors like Amplify Labs, Echo, and Synchron's Stentrode. Generally, there are 2 approaches, with Neuralinks involving attaching electrodes directly to brain tissue, while Echo uses headphones that scan brain activity, and Stentrode, kind of like it sounds like, places an electrode in a stent into blood vessels, the blood vessels that serve the brain. But in each case, we get an approximation of the first level of cyberization available in Ghost in the Shell: basic control of computer devices and access to the internet. With your mind. Once you get online in Ghost in the Shell, though, you find some stuff that was kind of predictive and now kind of quaint. A funny one from these screenshots is that by the 2030s, web page design wraps back around to Web 1.0. And now this is just one of those funny things where sci-fi designers' imagination fails at certain key points. Here they can imagine sophisticated man-machine virtual reality interfaces, can't imagine a web browser better than Internet Explorer. On the more predictive side, you see a prevalence for VR chat rooms as the way for people to convene. In Season 1, Motoko visits one to discuss the Laughing Man phenomenon, taking on an avatar other than her own. There have been halting efforts towards this, whether it's Facebook's ultra-cringe metaverse or the very cool but very not safe for work VR chat. Also seen in the rise of popularity of Discord communities, which return more conversational space to the fore of internet interaction after the period of everything centralizing in a few major social media companies. Motoko's use of an alternate identity here is probably more common in this universe than not, given how cyberization seems to promote identities of choice rather than the prevailing model in our social media, which for now still encourages you to post under your real name. Another thing that's become kind of real but is still kind of dorky in its implementation are AR glasses. Another long-shot bet of both Google and Meta, which is one layer away from the cybernetic eyes but employs the same concept that the people of Standalone Complex live with, which is that you can get your heads-up display anywhere and everywhere to help you interact with the world around you. And I'll admit to not being too jazzed about this one, just like how the Major could have the Tachikoma in the corner of her vision. Imagine having Copilot or your messenger notifications constantly pinging in your line of sight. Aside from the problems of not being able to look away from your notifications ever, though, the other prosthetics in the world of Standalone Complex seem pretty rockin'. The Major and Bato have top-of-the-line prosthetics, giving them superhuman strength and durability, but the flashbacks in Second Gig reveal that the Major originally received her prosthetic body after being completely paralyzed in a plane crash, with this scene showing her struggling with the dexterity required to fold a paper crane. That kind of technology is another one that has come to fruition in the years since the show. Combining with the brain control tech that I mentioned earlier, prosthetics have been around for a long time in human history, of course, but have made immense progress in the last 50 years and continue to progress by leaps and bounds as the prosthetics are better engineered to coordinate with existing muscles and bones and use better and better materials. The recent advances in neurocomputer interfaces also have extended to the technology to control bionic limbs. through a technique called an antagonistic neural interface, or AMI. This technology allows prosthetics to mimic what's called proprioception, or the sense that allows us to feel where our body parts are in space relative to each other and allow for our unconscious limb coordination. These advances are lowering the barrier for people with prosthetics to learn the full range of motions that belonged to their natural limbs. But what about pure robotics? While human limbs are good for, humans, there's nothing that says our straight spine ape bodies are the best shape for getting any particular job done. There's a reason nature keeps evolving crabs, after all. And that brings us to the starring OCs of Standalone Complex, the Tachikomas. The Tachikomas were designed by Shiro himself for Standalone Complex, though were based on the Fuchikoma tanks appearing in earlier media. There are a variety of what is punnily called think tanks in the universe, which fit a variety of designs and just constitute an AI-powered tank, though the Tachikomas themselves aren't like any tank in our world quite yet. Me mentioning crabs wasn't a coincidence, though spider is the better analogy since they have the ability to spit out super adhesive strings as a more unconventional weapon alongside more conventional machine guns and grenade launchers. The Tachikomas fulfill the tank part of their design by allowing a human operator to ride in their abdomen, and yeah, the anime likes to show exactly how the Major likes to get into the tank. The Tachikoma also have sophisticated AI, too sophisticated, and let's put a pin in that for later on. The main things that are interesting about them for this phase are the immense mobility they have, with production IG and Shiro kind of designing them to function like jumping spiders. The focus on non-human mobility mimics some of the stronger advances in robotics since the show's release. Now, we've all seen these kind of videos from Boston Dynamics, which got famous last decade. The concept of a four-legged robot predates Ghost in the Shell by decades, and the quadrupedal design gives them a great advantage in balance that we see in these hilarious bullying videos. Multiple limbs that can move independently are great for maintaining balance and navigating difficult terrain, but the problem in the early 20th century related to the same problem I went over in the prosthetics section, proprioception. The main challenge for multi-limbed robots is not the physics of how the limbs move, that's actually not too advanced for society even capable of just making an internal combustion engine. The problem is coordinating them, and especially coordinating them dynamically to respond to uneven terrain. The first autonomous four-legged robot came from the University of Southern California in 1966. The spider-like style of the Tachikomas came around from a Tokyo Institute of Technology device called the Kumo-1 in 1976, but advances in image recognition and machine learning are a large part of what brought us to the present day. Setting aside the robot's abilities to really do anything, their agility and control is greatly enhanced by AI. And yes, there are military and law enforcement uses for these autonomous and animal-like robots. But this is something I want to point out that Standalone Complex kind of gets wrong. To get the news straight from the horse's mouth, this is a Pentagon photo from 2022. And note this line, the robot dog is used to replace warfighters. Replace. The autonomous nature of the Tachikomas has kind of precluded their real-life equivalents from being used as tanks or like a mech suit for combat operators. The name of the game for drones and military robots are to keep the humans, the ones on your side, out of harm's way. A modern military would look at something like the Tachikoma as useful for maybe rescue or conveying personnel to the front lines or to inaccessible areas, but not so much for the purposes of being controlled like a tank. To segue further into the idea of the Tachikomas as weapons, I want to talk briefly about some of the rapid advances in drone warfare which have been making great strides this century, especially during the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. That war has been an odd mixture of the combat of the future and the combat of the past due to the limitations of both sides. The Russians engaging in human wave tactics straight out of the Korean War, and the Ukrainians fighting back with trench networks that would make a 1916 Frenchman feel right at home. On the other hand, the Russians deploy ever-evolving waves of Iranian-designed Shahed drones, and the Ukrainians have fought back with ingenious schemes like, and we're staying on a theme here, Operation Spiderweb, which used drones smuggled inside mobile homes to attack Russian air assets all across the country, thousands of miles from the front. In some cases where the attacking drones lost connection with their operators, they used image recognition to identify the most vulnerable parts of the aircraft on final approach, showing how we're getting closer to seeing drones almost as junior teammates of a military squad, just like they are in Section 9. But then you have this, which is an example of a cyber attack Ghost in the Shell style. It looks really cool, but is probably the worst thing out of Ghost in the Shell in terms of being remotely like how things are in real life. I mean, I can forgive how they're visualizing it, that's not an issue here. Kick-ass visual metaphors for cyber attacking go way back, like, anyone here remember Reboot? But more the method of hacking itself being a bit more like the infamous worsts of Hollywood hacking, like, this infamous clip from NCIS. In a world where Ghost in the Shell's tech is possible, this kind of hacking would likely be impossible. Scope out this chart, where an 18-character password using all of the variables would take a hacker with a top-grade consumer GPU 28 trillion years to brute force. We're often shown throughout the show that the people with cyborg eyes don't need to read words like we do, instead reading something that looks like pages and pages of barcodes. They could easily set up a password far beefier than anyone could possibly knock down, no matter how cool your visual metaphor is. The trick to hacking in the modern day when faced with these limitations is finding backdoors, chinks in the digital armor where you don't need to apply force, or, like all of those know-before trainings IT makes you do at work, finding a way to get yourself through the front door through social engineering. The idea of manipulating people into doing your bidding has a role in both the Laughing Man and Goda's plots in the series, but a more realistic take on hacking would have had those kind of soft skills of digital forensics, charm, and finesse be the Major's real stock in trade for hacking. And it's kind of scary to think that someone could hack directly into your brain and start putting things in there that aren't yours. Which leads us to part 3. Philosophy. Now, when I rewatched the series recently, the scene we're currently viewing kind of stuck with me. Frankly, when I was younger and saw this scene, I was also bothered by it, but bothered by the idea that the Major would stop being a hot woman. Some decades and a lot of learning later, this scene still sticks out. The simplest thing that stuck out to me is has nobody in this universe thought to make a muscle mommy body type available? The extra funny thing about that line is it is and isn't a joke. Again, both the point of this video is to look at what the show got right and what the show got wrong. It's very fitting with the transhumanist ideas of a lot of sci-fi for Bato to suggest that the Major's gender is just utilitarian and not an intrinsic part of her. But it betrays kind of a funny blind spot for the show to just not imagine a hulking, muscle-bound woman body as an alternative here. This convo gets at something bigger as well. The Major sees her femininity as an essential part of herself still, at least essential to her default presentation to the world since body swapping in this world is fairly trivial, and some people are shown doing it for pleasure at points in the series. And I know I'm playing all the hits here, but we do have to talk about gender for a bit. The idea of gender being different than sex is fairly different in the scheme of things, best exemplified in the philosophical work of Judith Butler, like in her work Gender Trouble. Butler sees gender as a performance, as the social actions that coincide with our sex, except when they don't. A lot of the idea of the two being separate is hard for people to wrap their heads around. Being a man is having man parts, and being a woman is having lady parts, and the performances of masculinity and femininity are downstream of that in the orthodox explanation. But Ghost in the Shell and Cyberpunk broadly is a good case for examining the counterfactual. Who are you when your biology has been stripped almost entirely away from you? The Major has no endocrine system for hormones, no estrogen, no body parts to speak of. But she chooses to stay a woman despite the stated disadvantage that this poses for her in this muscle mommy-less world. In this screenshot you see the watch that was also referenced in the earlier clip, which in Standalone Complex Season 1 is a symbol for her lost humanity and a somewhat shallower excuse for her femininity. The watch wouldn't fit on a wider wrist. But its main use is in assuring her of her consistent self. The Major's femininity is interesting in particular because, per the clip I showed you earlier with young Major, she never actually went through puberty, going through a plane crash at age 6, which caused her to be completely paralyzed and led to her body being replaced with all prosthetics. For her, gender has always been a pure performance and not something that she was being internally driven to, or else why bother choosing a female body for herself at all? It suggests that in the world of Ghost in the Shell, gender is completely separate from sex and is something that's tied to the ghost. Stronger than just an idle preference, but also completely independent from hormones or any particular body parts. So your ghost has a gender, okay, what else does it have? I guess that's the million-dollar question both in the series and in real-world philosophy. Unfortunately for weirdos like me, the series never sits down with an in-universe philosopher to discuss what is and is not a ghost, but we do get some context clues. The ghost is meant to be the part of you that's completely unique in a world where everything else can get edited. In a few cases, you see ghosts used the way fingerprints or other biometrics are used today as a secure, unique identifier. That tells us that the ghost is knowable in this world, and identifiable as separate from other cognitive functions that can be purely artificial. There's also an episode where a terrorist leader uses a process called ghost dubbing, where he undertakes a risky process to make exact copies of his ghost to plug into other copies of his body so that he can be in multiple places at once. The process is flawed and dangerous, but again, possible, indicating that the ghost isn't outside the grasp of technology in this world. What makes the ghost special is that it's the only cognitive function of the human mind that tech in this world hasn't managed to create artificially, but put a pin in that too. From these context clues, we can determine that the ghost is consciousness, or self-awareness, or the self. The thing that Silicon Valley bros are pursuing feverishly while they make their slot machines, the thing that caused Skynet to go rogue and give us 2 good Terminator movies and other Terminator movies. The question of consciousness and the self has been one of the key topics of philosophy since the 1600s in René Descartes, when the first skeptics began to reach for something other than a soul. Though outside of the European tradition, this goes way back to early Buddhist philosophy. Because Buddhism was rooted in the idea that nothing is essentially real, they had to address the idea of a soul as a somewhat permanent, irreducible self, and figure out an explanation that provided for reincarnation, but also for eventually reaching nirvana and the cessation of that ego. But for all the effort of philosophers or neuroscientists in more recent years, we're still only left with theories about what the irreducible self is. Per Ralph Lewis, writing for Psychology Today, there are 4 leading theories. Higher order theory. The consciousness is all of the other inputs, senses, memory, etc., being assembled as a higher order brain activity in the prefrontal cortex. Global workspace theory. Here you think of the brain like a big stage and consciousness is the spotlight pointing at whatever's in focus right now. Integrated information theory. Consciousness is created at the nexus of all the stuff that's going on in the brain at the time. The more stuff, the more conscious, which allows for consciousness and selfhood to occur on something like a sliding scale. Re-entry and predictive processing. Similar to higher order theory, it revolves around the higher parts of the brain sending information to the lower parts. Based on these 4, I'd say Standalone Complex makes its pick based on the story arc of the Tachikomas. When we're introduced to the Tachikomas as characters rather than as props, we see that they're eager to learn and that Bato's personal Tachikoma has been receiving special treatment in the form of getting organic motor oil instead of the synthetic that's standard for the fleet. They have a video gamified view of their lives, seeing their different experiences as data points and collecting them with the childlike wonder of a young gamer. Late in the first season, their growing willfulness freaks out Section 9, and the Major nearly puts them on ice. But then they get bigger fish to fry, and a few of the Tachikomas lose their frames in a heroic sacrifice. The second season focuses more heavily on the Tachikoma and the background of everything, leading up to another round of oh crap, they're getting too autonomous, and then getting put on ice again, though this time instead of being destroyed, they just have their programs transferred up into an orbiting satellite. In that satellite, at the very end of the story, you have the critical moment. And this one I'm not going to spoil because it really just clocks you in the feels, but there's a moment where they act autonomously to save the day. Ironically, their moment of clearly manifesting a self among themselves is enacted by a fundamentally selfless act. Getting back to the four theories, though, the Tachikoma seem to arrive at consciousness through the integrated information theory. Their gamer-like approach to collecting experience points and then syncing it amongst themselves allowed for an accelerating pace of learning. What fits with that theory is how the Tachikoma value each other's experiences, particularly the novel experiences, and that over the course of the series they're also granted full internet access in order to help the Major with various hacking endeavors. That the Tachikoma are able to break out into self-awareness is due to just how much information they were able to integrate, and consciousness emerged at the nexus of that. One last point before I go is the question of pure transhumanism in Ghost in the Shell. That is, humans completely transcending the need for a physical avatar and becoming beings of pure information. The practice of net diving, the usual interface we see with the web, is like a small version of this, but you always have your physical cyberbrain hooked in as a fallback. The only effort made towards full transhumanism was Hideo Kusei's final plan, which was conceived in desperation when it was learned that Goda planned to nuke the Dejima refugee camp with help from the Americans. Even being a reckless, short-notice plan, the technical feasibility wasn't doubted. What was doubted was whether a ghost could hold itself together living independently in the net, or whether the refugees and Kusei's ghosts would just get lost in the digital ether. It's implied in the end that Kusei succeeds in uploading himself, though the need to upload the refugees is averted thanks to spoilers, and that, at least for a time, he persists as himself in the net. Now, more about transhumanism comes from Standalone Complex 2045, but this video isn't about that. Nor is it about the Science Saru anime coming up next year, which will bring yet a new spin on the show. Thank you all for watching this video and downloading these experience points with me.